What if I told you that the American Civil War didn't truly end at Appomattox Courthouse on that quiet April morning in 1865? What if the handshake between Grant and Lee was merely theater? A carefully choreographed finale to satisfy the newspapers and the weeping widows, while in shadowed parlors and smoke-filled railroad cars, men in silk cravats were already dividing the spoils of a nation still bleeding. In the ashes of battlefields where over 600,000 souls had perished, something far more insidious than slavery was being born. An empire of steel, oil, and gold built on contracts no historian dared to fully excavate. These weren't the treaties you read about in textbooks. These were the whispered agreements, the burned ledgers, the handshakes sealed with blood money that would transform a broken republic into the richest nation on earth and condemn millions to a different kind of bondage. April 9th, 1865. General Robert E. Lee surrenders the Army of Northern Virginia. "The war is over," they said. Soldiers wept. Church bells rang from Boston to San Francisco. President Lincoln would be dead within days. Shot in a theater box while watching a comedy, his assassination unleashing chaos that would make the post-war period even more volatile than the war itself. But while the nation mourned, while freed slaves celebrated in the streets and Confederate veterans trudged home to scorched farmland, another war was beginning. A silent war, fought not with rifles and cannon, but with contracts and capital. In the ruins of Richmond, in the counting houses of New York, in the railroad depots of Chicago, powerful men were gathering. They had financed both sides of the conflict. They had grown obscenely wealthy, selling uniforms, rifles, and grain to armies that slaughtered each other. And now, with the South destroyed and the federal government desperate to rebuild, they saw opportunity. This is the story of those men, not the generals whose statues still stand in town squares, but the bankers, the railroad magnates, the carpetbaggers and scalawags who descended on the South like vultures on a carcass. This is the story of secret contracts signed in the days and weeks after Appomattox. Agreements that handed over millions of acres of southern land to northern industrialists. That sold the labor of freed slaves back into quasi-servitude through convict leasing programs. That built transcontinental railroads on the broken backs of Chinese immigrants and Irish laborers, while making a handful of men richer than kings. These contracts were hidden, burned, or buried in archives that wouldn't be opened for over a century. And when a detective, yes, an actual detective working for a private investigation firm in 1891, stumbled upon evidence of these deals, he was silenced before he could publish his findings. His name was Thomas Wentworth Clarke. You've never heard of him, and that's exactly the point. Clarke was a former Union intelligence officer who had worked under Allan Pinkerton during the war, tracking Confederate spies and saboteurs. After Appomattox, he became a private investigator specializing in corporate fraud. In 1889, while investigating a railway embezzlement case in Virginia, he discovered something that would consume the last years of his life. A cache of letters and contracts hidden in the wall of an abandoned plantation house outside Petersburg. These documents detailed agreements made in the immediate aftermath of Lee's surrender. pacts between Southern plantation owners desperate to save their estates and Northern industrialists eager to control the South's vast natural resources. Cotton futures, timber rights, coal mining concessions, and, most damning of all, labor contracts that essentially re-enslaved freed Black Americans under different names. Clarke spent 2 years verifying these documents, tracing signatures, cross-referencing dates. He was preparing to publish his findings in a series of newspaper exposés when, in March 1891, he disappeared. His body was found 3 weeks later in the Potomac River. The official cause of death? Accidental drowning. The documents he had collected? Gone. Vanished, as if they had never existed. But Clarke wasn't the only one who knew. Fragments of his investigation survived. Hidden in personal letters, coded references in his journals, testimony from witnesses who spoke to other investigators decades later. And when you piece together these fragments with newly discovered archival material from the Library of Congress, the National Archives, and private collections that have only recently been opened to researchers, a staggering picture emerges. The Gilded Age, that glittering era of robber barons and industrial titans, of Carnegie steel and Rockefeller's oil, of transcontinental railroads and towering skyscrapers, wasn't built solely on innovation and entrepreneurship. It was built on a foundation of secret deals made in the chaos after Appomattox. Deals that redistributed the wealth and resources of an entire region. Deals that created a new American aristocracy while condemning millions to poverty and exploitation. This is the story of those deals. This is the conspiracy that shaped modern America. This is the truth that was buried in the ashes of Appomattox. To understand what happened in the days after Appomattox, you must first understand what America looked like in April 1865. The nation was hemorrhaging. 4 years of total war had killed more Americans than all other American wars combined, from the Revolution through Vietnam. The South was physically destroyed. Cities burned, railroads torn up, plantations abandoned, the economy obliterated. Sherman's march to the sea had left a 60-mile-wide scar of scorched earth from Atlanta to Savannah. Richmond, the Confederate capital, was a smoking ruin. But the North was thriving. Factories in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania had run 24 hours a day, producing uniforms, boots, rifles, and ammunition. Railroad companies had laid thousands of miles of new track to move troops and supplies. Banks in New York and Philadelphia had financed the war through government bonds, accumulating unprecedented wealth and power. The war had accelerated America's industrial revolution by decades, but that revolution had happened entirely in the North. The South, meanwhile, had been bombed back into the pre-industrial age. Into this broken landscape came two kinds of men. The first were the carpetbaggers, Northerners who packed their belongings in cheap carpet bags and headed south seeking fortune in the chaos of Reconstruction. History has caricatured them as opportunistic villains, but the truth is more complex. Some were idealistic teachers and missionaries genuinely trying to help freed slaves.
Others were shrewd businessmen who recognized that Southern land, resources, and labor were suddenly available at fire sale prices. The second group were the scalawags, white Southerners who collaborated with Northern interests, often former Whigs who had opposed secession and now saw cooperation as the path to rebuilding their fortunes. These two groups, working together and often competing against each other, would reshape the South's economy in ways that still echo today. But behind both groups stood a third, more powerful force: Northern industrialists and financiers who never set foot in the South, but who pulled the strings from boardrooms in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. The Confederate surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, was remarkably generous. Grant allowed Lee's officers to keep their sidearms and permitted soldiers who owned horses to take them home for spring planting. There were no mass arrests, no firing squads, no public humiliations. It was the gentlemanly conclusion to a war fought between brothers. But this official magnanimity obscured a darker reality. The terms of surrender said nothing about property, nothing about debt, nothing about who would control the South's resources once the guns fell silent. Those questions would be answered in private negotiations that began even before Lee signed the surrender document. Within 48 hours of Appomattox, representatives of Northern railroad companies were already in Virginia negotiating for rights-of-way. Within a week, cotton brokers from New York were meeting with former plantation owners to arrange new labor systems. Within a month, Northern banks were offering loans to Southern landowners, loans with terms that would eventually transfer ownership when the inevitable defaults occurred.
President Abraham Lincoln might have moderated this exploitation. His vision for Reconstruction emphasized reconciliation and gradual integration of freed slaves into American society. But John Wilkes Booth's bullet on April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Appomattox, changed everything. Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union, suddenly became president. Johnson was sympathetic to Southern whites and hostile to radical Republican plans for black equality. His lenient Reconstruction policies allowed former Confederate leaders to quickly regain political power in the South. And these men, desperate to restore their economic fortunes, became willing partners in deals with Northern capital. The result was a perfect storm: Northern money, Southern resources, and a federal government too weak or unwilling to regulate the feeding frenzy. The stage was set for the greatest transfer of wealth in American history, a transfer that would be hidden in contracts, land deeds, and corporate charters that few people bothered to examine until it was far too late. Before we dive deeper into Thomas Clarke's investigation and the secret contracts he uncovered, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching this from? Are you in the American South, perhaps walking the same streets where these deals were made? Are you in the North, in cities built on the fortunes extracted from Reconstruction? Or are you watching from another country entirely, trying to understand how America became the economic superpower it is today? Drop a comment below and let me know your location and what brought you to this story.
Now, let's step back to April 1865 and begin tracing the paper trail that Thomas Clarke would follow 25 years later. A trail of contracts, bribes, and betrayals that transformed the United States from a broken republic into a gilded empire built on the ashes of civil war.
The first secret contract was signed on April 12, 1865, just 3 days after Appomattox, in a hotel room in City Point, Virginia. City Point had served as General Grant's headquarters during the siege of Petersburg, and it was still crawling with Union officers, military suppliers, and opportunists of every stripe. The hotel, a ramshackle wooden structure that had somehow survived the shelling, was where Samuel Wilkins, a railroad executive from Philadelphia, met with Colonel James Harrison, formerly of the Confederate Army and owner of 12,000 acres of prime timberland in southern Virginia. Harrison was desperate. His plantation house had been burned, his slaves were free, and he had no money to pay workers or taxes. Wilkins made him an offer. The Pennsylvania Central Railroad would assume Harrison's tax burden and provide capital for lumber operations in exchange for 99-year timber rights and a controlling share in any railroad construction across Harrison's land. Harrison signed. He had no choice. Within 6 months, Pennsylvania Central had logged half his forest and laid track straight through what had been his family's estate for 3 generations. This pattern repeated itself hundreds of times across the South in the spring and summer of 1865. Northern companies, flush with wartime profits, descended on the defeated Confederacy with contracts ready to sign. They targeted plantation owners, small farmers, municipal governments, anyone who owned land or resources and desperately needed cash. The terms were always similar. The Northern Company would provide immediate capital or assume debts in exchange for long-term control of resources or infrastructure. Sometimes these were legitimate business deals between willing partners. More often, they were predatory arrangements that transferred Southern wealth to Northern corporations, while leaving Southerners with little more than subsistence wages on land their families had owned for generations. The federal government, overwhelmed with demobilizing a million-man army and dealing with Lincoln's assassination, paid little attention to these private arrangements. Congress was focused on bigger questions: what to do with 4 million freed slaves, how to readmit Southern states to the Union, whether to punish Confederate leaders. The economic colonization of the South happened beneath the radar of national politics. But there was a darker dimension to these contracts, one that Thomas Clarke would later discover in those documents hidden in the Petersburg plantation wall. Some of these agreements weren't just about timber rights or railroad construction. They were about labor, specifically how to maintain access to black labor now that slavery had been abolished. The 13th Amendment had ended chattel slavery, but it contained a crucial loophole. Slavery could continue as punishment for crime. Southern states, with the tacit approval of President Andrew Johnson,
quickly passed black codes, laws that criminalized unemployment, vagrancy, breaking labor contracts, and even insulting gestures toward white people. These laws were designed to ensnare freed slaves and feed them into a new system, convict leasing. Under convict leasing, state governments would lease prisoners to private companies for labor. The companies paid the state a fee per prisoner and then worked those prisoners under conditions that were often worse than slavery. Unlike enslaved people who represented significant capital investment, leased convicts were expendable. If they died from overwork, disease, or abuse, the company simply leased more. Mortality rates in convict lease camps sometimes exceeded 50% annually.
The contracts Clarke discovered showed that Northern corporations were active participants in this system from the very beginning. Coal mining companies in Tennessee and Alabama, railroad construction firms in Mississippi and Louisiana, turpentine operations in Florida and Georgia. All of these entered into convict leasing arrangements within months of the war's end. Some contracts were direct. A Northern company would pay a Southern state government for convict labor. But other arrangements were more complex and more sinister. Clarke found evidence of agreements where Northern companies financed the expansion of Southern prison systems in exchange for guaranteed access to convict labor. In one particularly damning contract dated June 1865, a consortium of Pennsylvania coal operators provided $50,000 to Tennessee's government specifically to increase arrests and convictions of black men for vagrancy and contract violations. The contract specified that the coal companies would receive first priority for leasing these convicts at rates well below free labor costs. This wasn't just exploitation of a system, this was deliberate design and financing of a neo-slavery apparatus by Northern capital working with Southern state governments. The human cost was staggering. Between 1865 and 1900, hundreds of thousands of black men, women, and even children cycled through the convict leasing system. They built railroads, mined coal, harvested turpentine, cleared swamps, and constructed the infrastructure of the New South, all while subjected to brutal conditions that killed them in shocking numbers. Douglas Blackman's research, published over a century later in his book Slavery by Another Name, would document this system in detail. But in 1865, few white Americans knew or cared what was happening. The Northern press rarely covered conditions in Southern prisons and labor camps. When they did, they often portrayed convict leasing as a progressive reform that taught lazy former slaves the value of hard work. Southern newspapers defended the system as necessary to maintain order and prosperity in the post-war economy. The reality that this was a profit-driven system of racial control financed and operated by many of the same industrial interests that had claimed to fight the war to end slavery, remained hidden in contracts and ledgers that few people ever saw. Thomas Clarke saw them. In those documents from the Petersburg plantation, he found letters between Northern executives and Southern planters discussing not just timber and minerals, but labor supply. He found contracts that explicitly referenced the black codes and convict leasing. He found evidence that some of the most prominent names in American industry, men who would later be celebrated as pioneers and philanthropists, had profited directly from this system.
Clarke understood that he had uncovered something explosive, something that contradicted the triumphant narrative of Northern righteousness and Southern defeat. The war had supposedly been fought to end slavery and preserve the Union, but the documentary evidence showed that many Northern industrialists cared far more about profits than principles. They had found a way to extract Southern resources and exploit Southern labor just as effectively as the plantation system had. But now it was legal, rationalized, and largely invisible to the American public. Clarke knew this story had to be told. He also suspected, correctly, that powerful people would do anything to keep it buried.
To understand how these secret contracts shaped the Gilded Age, we need to follow the money. In 1860, before the war, the total wealth of the United States was approximately $16 billion. The South, despite having only 30% of the population, controlled roughly 30% of that wealth, primarily in land and enslaved people. By 1870, just 5 years after Appomattox, the South's share of national wealth had collapsed to 12%. Where did that wealth go? Some was destroyed in the war itself, burned cities, ruined crops, dead livestock. But most of it was transferred. Land that had been worth $10 an acre before the war sold for pennies during Reconstruction. Businesses that had been worth thousands were liquidated for hundreds. And Northern investors, armed with capital and contracts like those Clarke discovered, acquired these assets at Depression prices and then reaped enormous profits as the Southern economy slowly recovered. The railroad industry exemplifies this wealth transfer. Before the war, the South had about 9,000 miles of railroad track, much of it destroyed during the conflict. After the war, Southern railroad companies were bankrupt, their bonds worthless, their equipment rusted or stolen. Northern railroad magnates saw opportunity. Men like Jay Gould, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and Tom Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad moved aggressively into the South, buying up failed railroad companies, acquiring rights of way through contracts with desperate local governments, and then rebuilding lines with one crucial difference. The new railroads were designed not to serve Southern needs, but to extract Southern resources for Northern markets. Timber from Georgia would flow to sawmills in Baltimore. Coal from Alabama would feed steel mills in Pittsburgh. Cotton from Mississippi would supply textile factories in Massachusetts. The South was being transformed into a resource colony of the North, and the railroad contracts were the legal instruments of that transformation. But the biggest fortunes weren't made in railroads or timber or coal. They were made in oil and steel, the two industries that would define the Gilded Age and make America the world's industrial superpower. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil and Andrew Carnegie's steel empire both emerged in the 1870s and 1880s, and both depended critically on the post-war economic landscape. Rockefeller built Standard Oil's monopoly partly through ruthless competition and brilliant logistics, but also through favorable arrangements with railroad companies, many of which had grown fat on Southern Reconstruction contracts and needed Standard Oil's business to justify their expanded networks. Carnegie's steel mills in Pittsburgh needed coal and iron ore, and the cheapest sources were in the South, extracted by convict labor and transported on railroads controlled by Carnegie's allies.
Neither Rockefeller nor Carnegie directly participated in the immediate post-Appomattox contracts that Clarke investigated, but both benefited enormously from the economic structure those contracts created.
The financial sector underwent an even more dramatic transformation. Before the Civil War, American banking was fragmented and largely regional. The war changed everything. To finance the Union war effort, the federal government had created a national banking system and sold hundreds of millions of dollars in bonds. Northern banks, especially in New York and Philadelphia, became powerful institutions with unprecedented capital reserves. After the war, these banks turned their attention south. Southern landlords, plantation families, and small farmers all needed loans to rebuild. Northern banks were happy to oblige, but the terms were harsh. Interest rates often exceeded 20%. Collateral requirements meant that a single bad harvest or economic downturn would trigger foreclosure. Through these predatory lending practices, Northern banks acquired vast amounts of Southern property, which they then sold or leased to industrial concerns. J.P. Morgan, who would become the most powerful financier in America, began his ascent in this period, and his early fortune was built partly on Southern debt and foreclosure. The contracts Clarke discovered documented this process in chilling detail. One cache of letters he found showed correspondence between a Philadelphia bank and a network of local agents in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. These agents were tasked with identifying landlords in financial distress and offering them loans with terms virtually guaranteed to result in default. The letters discussed these borrowers with cold calculation, referring to them as marks and prospects, and celebrating foreclosures as acquisitions. In one particularly revealing letter dated October 1867, a bank executive wrote to an agent, "Do not concern yourself with their ability to repay. Our goal is the land, not the interest. The loan is merely the mechanism of transfer." Clarke recognized this for what it was, a systematic campaign to dispossess Southern landlords and transfer property to Northern financial interests. When he tried to verify the authenticity of these letters, he found that many of the transactions they described were indeed real, recorded in county deed books across the South. The evidence was irrefutable. Yet Clarke also discovered something that complicated the simple narrative of Northern villainy and Southern victimhood. Some Southerners were active, willing participants in this exploitation. The scalawags, Southern whites who cooperated with Reconstruction governments and Northern interests, often made fortunes by serving as intermediaries. They used their local knowledge and connections to identify opportunities for Northern investors, and they took generous commissions for their services. Some became wealthy landlords themselves, buying foreclosed properties and then selling them at markup to Northern corporations. Former Confederate officers sometimes partnered with Union veterans in business ventures that exploited the chaos of Reconstruction. The reality was messier than the lost cause mythology would later suggest. This wasn't a simple story of innocent Southerners being crushed by Yankee oppressors. This was a capitalist free-for-all where anyone with money, connections, or lack of scruples could profit from the misery of those who had none of those advantages. And the people who suffered most were those with the least power: freed slaves,
poor white farmers and laborers of all races who found themselves trapped in an economic system as brutal as the one the war had supposedly ended.
Thomas Wentworth Clarke wasn't looking for a historical conspiracy when he began investigating the Danville and Western Railroad Company in 1889. He was simply doing his job. A group of investors had hired his firm to look into suspicious accounting practices at the railroad, which operated lines in Southern Virginia and North Carolina. The investors suspected embezzlement, and Clarke's reputation for thorough financial investigations made him the obvious choice for the case. He spent weeks in Danville, examining ledgers, interviewing employees, and tracing the flow of money through the company's complex corporate structure. What he found was indeed embezzlement. The railroad's treasurer had been skimming funds for years, but he also found something far more interesting: references to land acquisitions in 1865 and 1866 that seemed wildly undervalued. Properties worth thousands of dollars had been purchased for pennies on the dollar. Clarke's curiosity was piqued. How had the railroad acquired so much land so cheaply in the immediate aftermath of the war? The trail led him to Petersburg, Virginia, a city that had been besieged for 9 months during the war's final year. Petersburg had suffered terrible damage, and many of its prominent families had been financially ruined. Clarke learned that one such family, the Bowlings, had owned a large plantation just outside the city. In 1866, the Bowling estate had been sold to the Danville and Western Railroad for a fraction of its pre-war value. Clarke traveled to the property, which was now bisected by railroad tracks and dotted with logging operations. The plantation house was still standing, barely. It was abandoned, its windows broken, its roof collapsing. Clarke, ever thorough, decided to examine the house to see if any old records might shed light on the property transfer. In a second-floor study, behind a section of wall paneling that had partially fallen away, he found them: a leather satchel containing letters, contracts, and other documents that the Bowling family, or someone, had hidden during the chaos of 1865 and 1866. The documents were extraordinary. There were letters from railroad executives, bank officials, and political figures discussing plans to acquire Southern properties. There were contracts for convict leasing, including the damning agreement between Pennsylvania coal operators and Tennessee's government. There were promissory notes showing loans that were clearly designed to force foreclosure. And there were more personal documents, letters from desperate Southern landowners begging for mercy, for extensions, for any accommodation that might help them keep their family properties. One letter, from a widow whose husband had died at Gettysburg, pleaded with a Philadelphia banker to give her more time to make a loan payment. The banker's reply, coldly professional, denied the request and informed her that foreclosure proceedings would begin immediately. Clarke, who had fought for the Union and believed in the righteousness of that cause, found himself disturbed by what he was reading. This wasn't the story of noble Northern liberators helping to rebuild a defeated South. This was exploitation, plain and simple. Clarke spent months authenticating the documents, cross-referencing names and dates with public records, tracking down surviving participants or their descendants. Everything checked out. The contracts were genuine, the letters were real, and the schemes they described had actually been executed. He expanded his investigation beyond the Danville and Western Railroad, looking for similar patterns in other industries and other regions. He found them. Coal companies in Tennessee,
timber operations in North Carolina, cotton brokerages in Mississippi, banks in New Orleans. The same pattern repeated everywhere. Northern capital moving south immediately after Appomattox, making deals that seemed advantageous in the moment, but which systematically transferred Southern wealth to Northern hands over the following decades. Clarke came to believe that there had been an informal but coordinated strategy among Northern business interests to use the post-war period as an opportunity for economic conquest. It wasn't a formal conspiracy with secret meetings and grand plans, but rather a shared understanding among industrialists and financiers that the South was now open for business on terms extremely favorable to those with capital. By 1890, Clarke had assembled a massive collection of evidence and was drafting a series of articles for publication. He approached several major newspapers, but editors were reluctant to run the story. The period from 1865 to 1890 seemed like ancient history to many Americans, who were more concerned with current issues like labor strikes, the influx of immigrants, and the closing of the Western frontier. Moreover, some of the men Clarke's investigation implicated were now among the most powerful and respected figures in American society. Accusing them of exploiting the post-war South seemed unpatriotic, even treasonous, especially since many of them had supported the Union cause. Clarke persisted. He refined his articles, gathered more evidence, and finally found a publisher. A smaller but reputable newspaper in New York City that specialized in investigative journalism. The first article was scheduled to run in April 1891, 26 years after Appomattox. Clarke was excited and nervous. He knew the articles would provoke controversy, perhaps even lawsuits, but he believed the truth needed to be told. He never got the chance. In early March 1891, Clarke traveled to Washington, D.C., to examine records at the War Department and the Library of Congress. He was staying at a boarding house near the Capitol and would spend his days in the archives, returning each evening to write up his notes. On March 15th, he left the boarding house in the morning and never returned. His landlady, concerned when he missed dinner and didn't come back that night, reported him missing to the police. For 3 weeks, there was no sign of him. Then, on April 4, his body was found in the Potomac River near Georgetown. He had been in the water for some time, making it difficult to determine a precise cause of death, but the coroner ruled it an accidental drowning. Clarke's family and friends were skeptical. He was a strong swimmer, he knew Washington well, and he had no reason to be near the river at night. But there was no evidence of foul play, and the police closed the case. When Clarke's associates went to his boarding house to collect his belongings, they found that all of his research materials were gone. The documents, the notes, the drafts of his articles, everything had vanished. The satchel from the Petersburg plantation house was never recovered.
The disappearance of Thomas Clarke and his evidence might have ended the story, but fragments survived. Clarke had been careful, perhaps paranoid. He had made copies of some documents and had shared information with trusted colleagues. One of these colleagues was a journalist named Margaret Hartley, who worked for the same New York newspaper that had agreed to publish Clarke's articles. Hartley was devastated by Clarke's death and suspicious of the circumstances.
She began her own quiet investigation, not trying to replicate Clarke's comprehensive research, but simply trying to verify whether the core claims he had been making were true. She didn't have access to the original documents from Petersburg, but she had her notes from conversations with Clarke, and she had some of the copies he had given her. Over the next several years, Hartley traveled through the South, examining county records, interviewing elderly residents who remembered the Reconstruction period, and piecing together the same pattern Clarke had identified. Hartley's investigation confirmed what Clarke had discovered. The years immediately following Appomattox had indeed seen a massive transfer of Southern wealth and resources to Northern interests through a combination of legal contracts, predatory lending, and exploitation of convict labor. But Hartley also discovered something Clarke hadn't fully appreciated: the long-term consequences of these arrangements. By the 1890s, the South was economically stagnant, with per capita income less than half that of the North. The region was trapped in a cycle of poverty and underdevelopment that would persist for another half-century. The contracts signed in 1865 and 1866 had locked the South into a colonial relationship with Northern capital, where Southern resources and labor enriched Northern corporations, while the South itself remained poor. Hartley realized that the great disparity between North and South in the 1890s wasn't simply a natural result of losing the war. It was a structural outcome engineered through those post-war contracts and the economic system they created. Hartley tried to publish her findings, but faced the same resistance Clarke had encountered. Editors didn't want to relitigate the Civil War and Reconstruction. The nation was moving forward, building skyscrapers and laying telephone cables and celebrating the approaching 20th century. Dwelling on old wounds seemed counterproductive. Moreover, the economic system Hartley described, Northern capital exploiting Southern resources and labor, was simply how capitalism worked. It wasn't a conspiracy, it was business. Hartley eventually published a few articles in small circulation magazines, but they made little impact. She continued her investigation privately until her death in 1904, leaving behind boxes of notes and documents that her family donated to a historical society in New York. Those boxes sat in storage for decades, their contents unexamined until historians began taking a fresh look at the Reconstruction era in the mid-20th century.
The Southern economy that emerged from Reconstruction and the Gilded Age was fundamentally different from the antebellum plantation economy, but it was no less exploitative. The old plantation system had relied on enslaved labor to produce cash crops, especially cotton. The new system relied on sharecropping, tenant farming, and convict leasing to produce the same crops while also extracting minerals, timber, and other resources. Freed slaves and poor whites alike found themselves trapped in cycles of debt and dependency. A sharecropper might work a piece of land owned by someone else, buying seed and supplies on credit from the landlord or a local merchant. At harvest time, after settling his debts, the sharecropper typically had little or nothing left. If he was in deficit and the accounting was controlled by the landlord or merchant, he would have to work another year to pay off the debt. This system legally bound workers to the land as effectively as slavery had, and it persisted well into the 20th century. The racial dimensions of this economic exploitation were impossible to ignore. While poor whites also suffered under sharecropping and debt peonage, the system was designed primarily to control black labor. The black codes, convict leasing, and discriminatory credit practices all targeted African Americans specifically. The Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, which abolished slavery, guaranteed equal protection, and protected voting rights, were systematically undermined by Southern state governments with the tacit approval of Northern businessmen who profited from racial oppression. By the 1890s, Southern states were implementing Jim Crow laws that mandated racial segregation and disenfranchised black voters through poll taxes, literacy tests, and other mechanisms. This legal framework of white supremacy made it easier to exploit black labor, because workers who couldn't vote, couldn't sue in court, and couldn't move freely had few options to resist exploitation. The economic and racial systems reinforced each other, creating a social order that would define the South for generations. Northern industrialists rarely acknowledged their complicity in this system. In public, many expressed support for black civil rights and criticized Southern racism. Andrew Carnegie, for example, funded libraries and educational institutions for black communities. But Carnegie's steel empire depended on Southern coal mined by convict labor, much of it black. John D. Rockefeller donated to black colleges and churches, but Standard Oil's operations in the South relied on the same discriminatory labor practices as every other industry. The contradiction between public philanthropy and private profit was rarely examined or discussed. The Gilded Age celebrated these men as titans of industry, self-made heroes of American capitalism. Their charitable foundations continue to shape American society today. But the origins of their fortunes, including the role that Reconstruction-era exploitation played in building those fortunes, remained hidden, buried in archives and forgotten memories, waiting for investigators like Thomas Clarke and Margaret Hartley to uncover them and for later historians to finally bring them to light. The Gilded Age earned its name from Mark Twain, who saw beneath the golden surface to the corruption and inequality underneath. Nowhere was this contrast more stark than in the lives of the industrial elite versus the workers who made their wealth possible. In 1890, the richest 1% of Americans owned more wealth than the bottom 50% combined. Industrialists built mansions on Fifth Avenue that cost millions of dollars, while their workers lived in tenement slums, where entire families crowded into single rooms without running water or ventilation. The disconnect between the rhetoric of opportunity and the reality of exploitation was enormous, and it was made possible by the economic structures established during Reconstruction. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a tiny elite didn't happen by accident. It was the result of deliberate policy choices and private agreements, including those secret contracts Thomas Clarke had discovered, that structured the post-war economy to benefit capital over labor. The railroads exemplify this dynamic. By 1890, the United States had over 160,000 miles of railroad track, more than all of Europe combined. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, was celebrated as a triumph of American ingenuity and perseverance.
But the construction of these railroads involved massive public subsidies, land grants, and favorable legislation that enriched railroad magnates while workers received poverty wages and endured brutal conditions. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads, which built the transcontinental line, received loans of up to $48,000 per mile from the federal government, plus land grants totaling millions of acres. Chinese immigrants who laid track through the Sierra Nevada were paid $1 a day, lived in camps exposed to the elements, and died by the hundreds in explosions and accidents. Irish workers on the Union Pacific faced similar conditions. The railroad companies kept most of the government subsidies and land grants as profit, rather than investing in safety or fair wages. In the South, railroad construction followed the same pattern. Northern railroad companies used convict labor where possible, men leased from state prisons at rates far below what free labor would cost. Where they couldn't use convicts, they employed black and white workers at subsistence wages under conditions that were dangerous and often deadly. Railroad construction was one of the most hazardous occupations in 19th century America, with workers crushed, burned, or blown apart in accidents that were usually the result of negligence driven by the company's desire to maximize profit and minimize costs. Yet, the railroad executives became some of the wealthiest men in the world. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who controlled the New York Central Railroad and several other lines, died in 1877 worth over $100 million, equivalent to roughly $2.5 billion today. Jay Gould, another railroad magnate, was worth over $70 million at his death. These fortunes were built on public subsidies, speculation, and the brutal exploitation of workers who had no legal protections and few alternatives.
The steel industry showed the same pattern. Andrew Carnegie's steel mills in Pittsburgh produced more steel than all of Britain by the 1890s, making Carnegie the second richest man in America. But Carnegie's workers labored 12 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week, in hellishly hot and dangerous conditions. Men were regularly injured or killed by molten metal, machinery, or exhaustion. When workers at Carnegie's Homestead Steelworks went on strike in 1892, demanding better wages and conditions, Carnegie's partner, Henry Clay Frick, hired Pinkerton detectives to break the strike. The resulting battle left 10 dead and dozens wounded, and the strike was crushed. Carnegie, who was in Scotland at the time and publicly claimed to support workers' rights, never took responsibility for the violence. His reputation as a benevolent industrialist remained largely intact, bolstered by his later philanthropic activities. But the men who died at Homestead and the thousands who worked under oppressive conditions in Carnegie's mills received no such rehabilitation. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company achieved its dominance through both innovation and ruthless anti-competitive practices. Rockefeller pioneered vertical integration, controlling every aspect of oil production, from drilling to refining to distribution. This gave Standard Oil enormous efficiency advantages. But Rockefeller also used those advantages to destroy competitors. He negotiated secret deals with railroads to get lower shipping rates for his oil, while forcing the railroads to charge competitors higher rates. He would temporarily slash prices in markets where competitors operated, selling oil below cost to drive them out of business, then raise prices once the competition was eliminated.
By 1890, Standard Oil controlled about 90% of oil refining in the United States. This monopoly power allowed Rockefeller to dictate terms to both suppliers and customers, extracting maximum profit from every transaction. Workers in Standard Oil refineries faced dangerous conditions, including exposure to toxic chemicals and frequent fires and explosions, while receiving wages barely sufficient to survive. The wealth generated during the Gilded Age was staggering, but it flowed almost entirely to a tiny elite. The average industrial worker in 1890 earned about $500 per year. Andrew Carnegie's annual income was over $25 million. That's a ratio of 50,000 to 1. Such extreme inequality was possible because workers had few rights and fewer options. Unions were small and weak, constantly under attack from employers and the government. Strikes were often broken by private security forces or state militias. Courts consistently ruled in favor of employers in labor disputes. There was no minimum wage, no maximum hours, no safety regulations, no workers' compensation, no unemployment insurance. Workers who were injured on the job could be fired and replaced, with no compensation for their injuries. Children as young as 8 or 10 worked in factories, mines, and mills because families needed every penny to survive. This was the human cost of the Gilded Age, the price paid by ordinary people for the fortunes of the elite. And much of that fortune originated in the post-Appomattox contracts that restructured the Southern economy and established patterns of exploitation that spread throughout the industrializing nation.
The story of Thomas Clarke's investigation faded into obscurity for decades, but the economic structures he had documented continued to shape American society. The South remained poor and underdeveloped relative to the North well into the 20th century. The racial caste system established during Reconstruction, reinforced by Jim Crow laws and defended by terrorism from groups like the Ku Klux Klan, persisted until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a small elite, which became so extreme during the Gilded Age, fluctuated over the following century but never disappeared. The contracts Clarke found weren't anomalies. They were examples of how American capitalism operated when freed from significant regulation or oversight. Understanding this history helps explain why America developed the way it did, why the South remained economically stagnant for so long, why racial inequality proved so persistent, and why economic inequality has been such a defining feature of American society. In the early 20th century, progressive-era reformers began to challenge the excesses of Gilded Age capitalism. Journalists known as muckrakers exposed corruption, exploitation, and inequality in American industry and government. Ida Tarbell's investigation of Standard Oil, published in 1904, documented the company's anti-competitive practices and helped lead to its breakup under antitrust law in 1911. Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle, published in 1906, exposed horrific conditions in meatpacking plants and led to food safety regulations. Jacob Riis photographed tenement slums, showing middle-class Americans how the urban poor lived.
These reformers accomplished significant changes: new laws regulating food and drugs, restrictions on child labor, improved working conditions, and the beginnings of a social safety net. But they didn't fundamentally alter the economic structures established during Reconstruction and the Gilded Age. Capital still dominated labor. Northern industrialists still controlled much of the Southern economy, and racial oppression remained entrenched. The Great Depression of the 1930s brought more substantial changes. President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal established Social Security, unemployment insurance, the right to unionize, minimum wage laws, and numerous other reforms that provided workers with protections and security they had never had before. The New Deal didn't end capitalism, but it constrained it, creating a regulated market economy that balanced the interests of business, labor, and the public. The result was the most sustained period of broadly shared prosperity in American history. From roughly 1940 to 1970, American workers saw consistent wage growth, expanding benefits, and improving living standards. The middle class grew dramatically. But even during this period, the benefits weren't shared equally. Black Americans, especially in the South, faced continued discrimination in employment, housing, and education. The New Deal's agricultural programs often excluded sharecroppers and tenant farmers who were disproportionately black. Federal housing programs explicitly promoted racial segregation. The post-war prosperity that lifted many white families into the middle class largely bypassed black communities. The civil rights movement challenged this racial inequality head-on. Through protests, legal challenges, and political organizing, activists dismantled Jim Crow laws, secured voting rights, and began to address economic discrimination. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were landmark achievements that fundamentally changed American society. But economic inequality persisted and, in some ways, worsened. Beginning in the 1970s, American capitalism underwent another transformation, sometimes called neoliberalism. Deregulation, weakening of unions, tax cuts for the wealthy, and the globalization of production. These policies produced enormous economic growth, but the benefits flowed primarily to those at the top. By 2020, wealth inequality in the United States had returned to levels not seen since the Gilded Age. The richest 1% owned more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. This pattern would have been familiar to Thomas Clarke, who documented similar inequality in the 1890s. Understanding the deals made after Appomattox helps us understand how we got here. The secret contracts Clarke investigated weren't just historical curiosities. They were early examples of how concentrated capital could reshape society in its own interests when political and legal constraints were weak. The post-Civil War period was a moment of massive transition, when fundamental questions about American society needed to be answered. What would happen to freed slaves? How would the South be reintegrated into the nation? what role would the federal government play in regulating the economy? The answers to these questions were determined not primarily through democratic deliberation, but through private agreements between powerful economic actors. Those agreements established patterns that persist today. A relatively weak federal role in regulating capitalism, an economy that generates enormous wealth but distributes it very unequally, and a racial hierarchy that maps disturbingly well onto economic hierarchy. These aren't inevitable features of market economies. They're the results of specific historical choices and arrangements, including those secret contracts signed in the ashes of Appomattox. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. This story doesn't have a tidy ending because we're still living in the world those contracts helped create. The deals that Thomas Clarke uncovered, the exploitation he documented, the inequality that resulted, these aren't just historical facts. They're ongoing realities that shape our present. If this story has made you think differently about American history, about capitalism, about how wealth and power operate in society, then please subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and share this video. Drop a comment telling me what surprised you most about this story, or what connections you see to our current moment. History isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how the past created the present and imagining how we might create a different future. The contracts may have been secret, but their consequences are all around us. The question now is, what are we going to do about it?